The world today faces division, crisis, and uncertainty. What kind of leadership can guide us forward? Nelson Mandela's life offers an answer. In this episode, we explore how Mandela's resilience, forgiveness, and vision shaped a nation, and how his principles can inspire today's leaders. Stay with us and discover why his legacy is not just history, but a call to action for our time. The architect of a new nation. When we speak of Nelson Mandela as the architect of a new nation, we are referring to much more than the moment he took the oath of office in 1994. We are speaking about a life that intertwined personal sacrifice, political struggle, and visionary leadership into the blueprint of a democratic South Africa. To understand how Mandela became that architect, we must trace the long arc from his early years, through his radicalization as a young lawyer, into the fiery days of resistance, and finally to his transformation into a statesman who could negotiate freedom not only for his people, but also for those who once oppressed them. Mandela was born in 1918 in the rural Transkei, in a small village called Mvezo. His early childhood was far removed from the political turmoil of the cities, but it was not untouched by the deep inequities of the land. South Africa at that time was already divided along rigid racial lines. The white minority, empowered by colonial structures, held power and privilege, while black South Africans lived with limited rights, reduced land ownership, and daily indignities. Yet in his village, Mandela absorbed traditions of African leadership. He listened to elders at the Great Place, where disputes were settled not by coercion, but by consensus. This early exposure to a consultative style of governance would shape his own political instincts decades later, when he would stand before the world as president. Mandela's education marked another formative stage. At institutions like Fort Hare University, he encountered a new generation of Africans who were eager to challenge the status quo. The colonial system tried to teach submission, but Mandela and his peers instead learned ambition. They studied law, politics, and history, seeking to reclaim dignity for their people. It was at Fort Hare and later in Johannesburg that Mandela encountered the African National Congress, an organization that would become the vessel of his life's mission. At first, the ANC advocated petitions and polite appeals to the colonial government. But as the machinery of apartheid hardened after 1948, Mandela realized that more direct confrontation was inevitable. By the 1950s, Mandela had become one of the leaders of the ANC Youth League. He believed that young Africans could no longer wait for change to come from benevolent rulers. Instead, they had to organize mass action. Together with leaders like Oliver Tambo and Walter Sisulu, Mandela pushed for boycotts, strikes, and civil disobedience campaigns. The Defiance Campaign of 1952 was one of the first large-scale protests against apartheid laws, and it thrust Mandela into the national spotlight. For his role, he was arrested and banned, but he also earned the admiration of thousands who saw him as a fearless leader. Yet Mandela's transformation was not straightforward. For much of the 1950s, he remained committed to nonviolent resistance, inspired in part by Mahatma Gandhi's earlier campaigns in South Africa. But the brutal repression by the apartheid state tested these convictions. The Sharpeville Massacre of 1960, where police killed 69 peaceful protesters, became a turning point. Mandela and his comrades concluded that nonviolence alone could not dismantle a system sustained by violence. It was then that Mandela helped establish Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the ANC. For this decision, he would later be branded a terrorist by the state and even by many governments abroad. Yet he insisted that sabotage against infrastructure was the only path left when peaceful protest was met with bullets. In 1962, Mandela was arrested and eventually sentenced in the famous Rivonia trial. Facing the death penalty, he delivered a speech that still echoes through history. He declared his readiness to die for the ideal of a democratic and free society where all people could live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. That speech elevated Mandela from a national activist to a global symbol of resistance. It was not only the words, but the calm dignity with which he delivered them that struck observers. Here was a man who did not seek vengeance, but justice, not domination, but equality. The years that followed were long and grueling. Mandela would spend 27 years in prison, most of them on Robben Island. It was there that his identity as a fighter began to evolve into that of a statesman. Within the confines of prison, he became a teacher, a mediator, and a source of inspiration to his fellow inmates. He studied the psychology of his jailers as much as he studied the law. He realized that in order to build a future democratic South Africa, he would need not only to liberate the oppressed, but also to win over the hearts of those who had once enforced oppression. The seeds of reconciliation were planted not in the presidential office, but in the stone quarries of Robben Island. By the late 1980s, the apartheid system was faltering under internal resistance and international sanctions. It was then that Mandela, still imprisoned, began secret negotiations with representatives of the apartheid government. This was no simple decision. Many in the ANC feared betrayal. They worried that negotiating before victory was secured would undermine their struggle. But Mandela understood that architecture is about building bridges. He was willing to take the political risk because he believed that South Africa's survival depended on a peaceful transition, not a bloody civil war. His courage in talking to his enemies, while still behind bars, redefined what leadership looked like in a world torn by mistrust. When Mandela finally walked free in 1990, the world watched a man who had endured decades of hardship without bitterness. His release was not the end of his journey, but the beginning of South Africa's transformation. Over the next 4 years, he led negotiations that dismantled apartheid and prepared the nation for its first democratic elections. In 1994, standing on the steps of the Union Buildings in Pretoria, Mandela took the oath of office as South Africa's first black president. The symbolism was profound. The same land where laws had once segregated people by skin color now witnessed the inauguration of a leader committed to unity. Mandela's role as architect was not limited to political structures. He sought to construct a new national identity. He knew that reconciliation could not simply be decreed. It had to be embodied in the daily life of the nation. That is why he emphasized symbols, like wearing the Springbok rugby jersey during the 1995 Rugby World Cup. For many Black South Africans, The Springboks were a symbol of white dominance, yet Mandela wore the jersey as a gesture of inclusion, showing that the new South Africa would embrace even the symbols of its painful past, transforming them into emblems of unity. The transition Mandela led was not perfect. South Africa faced immense challenges: economic inequality, crime, and social tensions that still persist today. But the architectural metaphor remains fitting. No building is flawless, yet its foundation determines whether it can endure storms. Mandela laid the foundation for a democratic South Africa by blending vision with pragmatism, conviction with compromise, and justice with reconciliation. To call Mandela the architect of a new nation is to acknowledge both his courage and his wisdom. He did not merely imagine a better future, he painstakingly built the framework for it. From the rural hills of the Transkei to the stone quarries of Robben Island, from the courthouse at Rivonia to the presidency in Pretoria, Mandela constructed not just a political order, but a moral vision. His legacy as an architect challenges us today to ask, what kind of nations are we building? And do we have the patience, humility, and courage to build them with the same resilience? The power of forgiveness and reconciliation. When Nelson Mandela walked out of prison in 1990 after 27 years behind bars, he faced a choice that would define the future of South Africa. He could have chosen revenge, and no one would have been surprised. After all, the system of apartheid had denied him freedom, torn families apart, and inflicted suffering on millions of South Africans. Yet Mandela did something remarkable. He chose forgiveness and reconciliation. This decision not only set the tone for South Africa's transition, but also offered the world a living model of how to heal societies wounded by hatred. Mandela understood something profound. Forgiveness was not a weakness, but a source of strength. His years in prison taught him that carrying bitterness would only enslave him further. True freedom required the release of anger, both for himself and for his country. In his memoirs, he reflected that while walking out of the prison gates, he knew that if he did not leave his bitterness behind, he would still be in prison. This insight became the foundation of his approach to leadership in the new South Africa. One of the boldest aspects of Mandela's leadership was his willingness to embrace those who had once been his enemies. He did not demonize the white minority population, even though many had benefited from apartheid. Instead, he extended a hand of partnership. He knew that the survival of South Africa depended on including all groups in building the future. If he sought revenge, the nation would descend into civil war. If he chose reconciliation, there was a chance for peace. This approach was tested immediately after his release. Negotiations between the African National Congress and the National Party government were tense. Violence flared in many communities, fueled by mistrust. But Mandela consistently urged dialogue over vengeance. He met not only with allies, but with leaders of the apartheid regime. He spoke to generals who had once overseen the brutal suppression of his people. His calm presence and willingness to listen surprised many. Instead of returning anger with anger, he responded with dignity. The message was clear. Reconciliation was not about forgetting the past, but about choosing a different future. By sitting at the table with those who once sought his destruction, Mandela demonstrated that forgiveness could be a strategic act of nation building. Perhaps the most radical step in Mandela's strategy was the creation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC. Led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the TRC was established to deal with the crimes of apartheid. Unlike traditional trials that focus solely on punishment, the TRC sought to uncover the truth, promote healing, and foster forgiveness. Perpetrators of human rights abuses could apply for amnesty if they fully confessed their crimes. Victims had the chance to tell their stories in public, to have their suffering acknowledged. The hearings were often emotional. Families of victims recounted their pain. Former policemen admitted to brutal acts of torture and killing. The process was imperfect and controversial. Some believed that justice was sacrificed for the sake of reconciliation. Others felt that amnesty allowed perpetrators to escape true accountability. But what mattered most was the principle. South Africa chose not to bury its past in silence, nor to be consumed by vengeance. Instead, it chose to confront the truth openly, however painful, in the hope that honesty could lay the groundwork for healing. The TRC became a global model. Countries emerging from conflict, from Rwanda to Northern Ireland, studied South Africa's approach. It showed that reconciliation requires courage, not denial. By allowing both victims and perpetrators to be heard, the Commission acknowledged human dignity on both sides, even in the face of terrible crimes. Mandela's commitment to forgiveness was not only moral but also practical. He understood that South Africa could not afford endless cycles of retribution. Economically, politically, and socially, the nation needed stability. Forgiveness created the possibility of cooperation across racial divides. It allowed a country long fractured to imagine itself as one. Consider the example of the 1995 Rugby World Cup. For many Black South Africans, rugby was a symbol of white supremacy. The national team, the Springboks, had been loved by Afrikaners but hated by the oppressed majority. Mandela, however, saw an opportunity. He publicly supported the team, even wearing the green Springbok jersey during the final match. When South Africa won the championship, Mandela's gesture united the country in celebration. What had once been a symbol of division became, in that moment, a symbol of unity. This act of forgiveness and inclusion demonstrated his genius as a reconciler. He turned sport into a political tool of nation building. Mandela's model of reconciliation remains deeply relevant in today's world. Across the globe, societies face polarization, ethnic conflict, and political divisions. Many leaders exploit these divisions, using anger to gain power. Mandela showed a different path. He proved that reconciliation is not naive idealism, but a realistic strategy for peace. In our time, we can see echoes of South Africa's challenges. Nations divided by race, religion, or politics often face the temptation of revenge. Yet Mandela's example challenges us to ask, what kind of future do we want to create? Do we want to perpetuate cycles of hate? Or do we want to build systems that allow forgiveness, accountability, and healing? For instance, consider the conflicts in the Middle East or the political polarization in democracies around the world. These situations demand leaders who can move beyond the language of blame and toward the vision of reconciliation. Mandela's decision to forgive did not mean abandoning justice. It meant reimagining justice as a tool to repair society rather than destroy it. At the heart of Mandela's approach was the idea that true leadership means carrying the burden of reconciliation on behalf of others. Forgiveness was not about excusing crimes. It was about freeing the future from being chained to the past. He showed that leadership requires the courage to take the harder road, the one that seeks unity rather than revenge. This lesson is particularly urgent for today's leaders. In times of crisis, it is easier to rally people around anger. It takes far greater courage to inspire them with forgiveness. Mandela demonstrated that such courage can transform not only individuals, but entire nations. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission may not have solved all of South Africa's problems. The nation continues to struggle with inequality and injustice. But the Commission created a foundation. It showed that facing the truth is the beginning of healing, and that reconciliation is a journey, not a single act. Mandela's willingness to choose forgiveness over vengeance built a blueprint for societies everywhere. Confront the past honestly, offer space for healing, and build a future on shared humanity. Mandela once said that resentment is like drinking poison and hoping it will kill your enemy. His life embodied the opposite, releasing resentment and finding freedom. This insight is not only relevant for nations, but for individuals as well. Each of us faces situations where forgiveness seems impossible. Yet Mandela reminds us that forgiveness is not a gift to others, but a liberation for ourselves. Mandela's power of forgiveness and reconciliation was revolutionary. He turned what could have been a bloody transition into a relatively peaceful one. He transformed symbols of division into emblems of unity. He offered the world a model of how to face painful history without being consumed by it. His example continues to echo across time, reminding us that reconciliation is the highest form of strength, and forgiveness is the foundation of lasting freedom. As we move forward, we carry this lesson into our own divided world. The path to peace and justice is not paved with revenge, but with the courage to forgive and the vision to reconcile. Resilience in the face of adversity. Resilience is often described as the ability to recover from difficulties, to bend without breaking. Few lives illustrate this better than Nelson Mandela's. For 27 years, he lived behind bars, first at Robben Island, later at Pollsmoor Prison, and Victor Verster Prison. These were not simply lost years. They were transformative years that turned a fiery activist into a patient, disciplined leader ready to guide a divided nation. To understand the depth of his resilience, we must look not only at the harshness of his imprisonment, but also at the inner discipline and flexibility that allowed him to turn adversity into preparation for leadership. When Mandela arrived at Robben Island in the 1960s, conditions were deliberately brutal. The prison authorities wanted to break the spirit of political prisoners. Mandela and his fellow inmates were forced into hard labor, crushing stones under the hot sun in the limestone quarry. They were fed meager rations, often insufficient to maintain strength. They were allowed few visits from family and their mail was heavily censored. Even the simplest request, like reading a newspaper, became a battle. Mandela's status as a political prisoner meant that he was constantly under surveillance. Guards sought to humiliate him, enforcing petty rules to remind him of his powerlessness. At first glance, the intention of the system seemed clear: strip the prisoners of dignity, isolate them, and weaken their resolve. Yet Mandela responded differently. He decided that he would not let prison define him. He treated the harsh environment as a school, both for himself and for those around him. He encouraged other inmates to study, to debate, and to use their time to grow intellectually. The prison yard became a kind of university. Younger activists learned history, politics, and philosophy from their elders. Mandela himself studied Afrikaans, the language of his oppressors, believing that understanding their culture was essential for future negotiations. In this way, the very attempt to silence him became an opportunity to prepare for leadership. What kept Mandela from despair during those long years? One answer was his unshakable sense of purpose. He believed his life was part of a larger struggle, and that even in prison he could serve that struggle. He wrote letters to his family and colleagues, carefully crafted to avoid censorship while still offering encouragement. He fought for small improvements in prison conditions, such as better clothing and access to education, seeing each victory as proof that persistence mattered. Mandela also developed remarkable self-discipline. He exercised regularly in his cell, keeping his body strong. He meditated on his goals, keeping his mind focused. He resisted bitterness, reminding himself that hatred would only consume him. Instead, he practiced patience, believing that time was an ally rather than an enemy. This mindset was crucial. 27 years could have broken him, but instead it refined him into someone who could wait for the right moment to act. One of the most striking aspects of Mandela's resilience was his strategic flexibility. He did not cling blindly to ideology. While he never abandoned the goal of democracy, he was willing to adapt his methods. During the 1980s, as South Africa faced growing unrest and international sanctions, some government officials began to consider reforms. Mandela, still in prison, was approached for secret talks. Many of his comrades opposed this, fearing it would signal weakness. But Mandela saw opportunity. He reasoned that refusing to talk would achieve nothing, while dialogue could open doors. He met with members of the apartheid government, including Justice Minister Kobe Coetsee. At first, the meetings were tentative, but over time they grew more substantial. Mandela listened carefully, even as he remained firm on principles. He learned to read his opponents, to understand their fears. He realized that many white South Africans did not only fear losing power, they feared retribution. To negotiate effectively, Mandela needed to offer not just democracy, but reassurance. This was resilience in action, the ability to see beyond personal anger and to think strategically about the future of the nation. Mandela's flexibility did not mean surrender. It meant adapting tactics to ensure that the larger vision, freedom for all South Africans, remained within reach. Inside prison, Mandela also honed his skills as a leader. Among the prisoners, disputes sometimes arose about strategy, ideology, or daily life. Mandela often acted as a mediator. He listened, sought common ground, and encouraged unity. His calm authority earned him respect, even from prison guards. Some wardens who had once treated him with hostility came to regard him with admiration. This ability to command respect without demanding it became one of Mandela's greatest assets. It was not charisma alone, but a combination of dignity, patience, and fairness. By the time he was released, he was not only the symbolic leader of the anti-apartheid movement, but also a seasoned statesman with practical skills in conflict resolution. What does Mandela's resilience teach us today? First, it reminds us that adversity does not have to define us. The challenges we face, whether personal setbacks or national crises, can become opportunities for growth if we approach them with patience and purpose. Second, his example shows that resilience requires both strength and flexibility. Mandela never abandoned his ultimate goal, but he adapted his methods to changing circumstances. In today's complex world, where leaders face challenges from climate change to economic inequality, this balance of principle and pragmatism is vital. Third, Mandela's willingness to negotiate with his oppressors offers a lesson for modern conflict resolution. True resilience is not stubborn defiance at all costs. It is the wisdom to know when to compromise, when to listen, and when to build bridges. For leaders navigating divided societies today, this is perhaps Mandela's most urgent lesson. Mandela's resilience was not his alone, it was also collective. His fellow prisoners shared in the struggle, and their solidarity strengthened them all. Resilience, in this sense, was not just an individual trait, but a communal resource. Each man drew strength from the others, and together they endured what might have been unbearable alone. This too speaks to our time. In facing global crises, resilience must be built not only within individuals, but across communities and nations. Just as Mandela and his comrades supported each other in prison, so too must societies today cultivate solidarity to withstand adversity. Nelson Mandela's 27 years in prison are often described as lost time. In truth, they were years of preparation. Through hardship, he developed patience. Through isolation, he learned the value of community. Through oppression, he discovered the power of negotiation. Resilience, for Mandela, was not passive endurance, but active transformation. When he emerged from prison in 1990, he carried with him not bitterness, but wisdom. His resilience had turned him into the kind of leader South Africa needed, principled yet pragmatic, strong yet compassionate, unyielding in his vision, yet flexible in his methods. For today's leaders and for all of us, his example challenges us to ask, how can we turn our own struggles into preparation for greater service? How can we face adversity not with despair, but with resilience that transforms pain into purpose? Mandela's life offers this enduring lesson. Resilience is not merely surviving the storm, but learning to dance in the rain, to transform hardship into strength, and to emerge ready to build a future once thought impossible. Mandela's enduring principles for modern leadership. Leadership is a word often used, but rarely understood in its deepest sense. For Nelson Mandela, leadership was never about titles or personal glory. It was about service, about embodying values that could guide a fractured nation toward unity. His principles of leadership remain as relevant today as they were in the turbulent years of South Africa's transition. They were not abstract theories, but lived practices, forged through decades of struggle, prison, and reconciliation. By studying these principles, modern leaders, whether in politics, business, or community life, can learn how to lead with courage, integrity, and empathy. At the heart of Mandela's leadership was the idea of servant leadership. He consistently placed the needs of the people above his own. Even before becoming president, he demonstrated this in his willingness to sacrifice personal comfort. His long imprisonment was not only a political consequence, but also a personal cost he accepted for the greater good. As president, Mandela could have pursued wealth or power. Instead, he lived modestly, giving up much of his salary to charitable causes. He invited children from different communities to the presidential residence, breaking down the distance between ordinary citizens and the state. These actions sent a powerful message. Leadership is not about ruling from above, but serving from within. For modern leaders, this principle challenges the culture of self-interest that too often dominates politics and business. Servant leadership asks, are you willing to put the collective good above personal gain? Are you willing to step down from the pedestal and walk among those you lead? Mandela's example shows that true authority comes not from domination, but from service. Mandela's integrity was another cornerstone of his leadership. Integrity is tested not in easy times, but in moments of crisis. Throughout his life, Mandela faced temptations to abandon principle for convenience. He was offered early release from prison if he renounced the struggle. He refused. He was pressured to compromise on democracy during negotiations with the apartheid government. He held firm. This consistency gave him credibility. People trusted his words because they saw he lived by them. Integrity for Mandela was not about perfection, but about alignment, ensuring that his actions matched his values. Today, in a world where corruption, dishonesty, and short-term thinking erode public trust, Mandela's ethical compass is a reminder that leadership without integrity is hollow. Decisions made without principle may bring temporary advantage, but they cannot build lasting legitimacy. Modern leaders who prioritize ethics over expedience can create trust that outlives their terms in office. Mandela was renowned for his ability to listen. In negotiations, he gave his opponents space to speak, even when their words were offensive. He wanted to understand their fears as well as their ambitions. This was not weakness, but strategy. By listening, he gained insight into what truly mattered to others, and this gave him the ability to find common ground. Empathy was the companion to his listening. He could imagine the world through the eyes of his adversaries. This allowed him to craft solutions that reassured them, reducing their resistance to change. For example, during the transition to democracy, he recognized that many white South Africans feared retribution. By addressing these fears openly, he built trust. In a time when political debates are often reduced to shouting matches, Mandela's approach of empathetic listening offers a model for effective leadership. Leaders today face polarized societies where opposing groups feel unheard. By practicing listening with empathy, leaders can build bridges where none seem possible. Mandela believed deeply in consensus. This principle was rooted in his early childhood experiences in the Thembu royal court, where decisions were made collectively after long discussions. He carried this tradition into modern politics. During the negotiations to end apartheid, Mandela insisted on broad participation. He worked not only with his allies, but also with opponents. He brought multiple political parties to the table, recognizing that true democracy requires inclusion. His leadership style was not authoritarian, but collaborative. He understood that a decision imposed by force may be obeyed, but a decision built by consensus will endure. Consensus building was not easy. It required patience, compromise, and persistence. But Mandela believed that only by involving diverse voices could South Africa build a foundation strong enough to withstand future storms. For today's leaders, in an age of division and rapid change, the lesson is clear. Inclusion is not a luxury, it is a necessity. Whether leading a nation, an organization, or a community, building consensus creates ownership and stability. Another remarkable principle of Mandela's leadership was his humility. Unlike many leaders who cling to power, Mandela chose to serve only one term as president. He could have remained in office, enjoying the prestige and influence. Instead, he stepped aside to allow others to lead. This decision reinforced his belief that leadership is about institutions, not individuals. By stepping down, he showed that democracy must be bigger than one person. He left office with his dignity intact, admired globally, not only for what he achieved, but also for how he let go. In a world where many leaders overstay their welcome, Mandela's humility is a rare lesson. True greatness is not measured by how long one holds power, but by how well one prepares others to take over. For modern leadership, this is a powerful reminder that succession planning and institution building are as important as individual vision. Mandela often said that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. His life demonstrated this principle repeatedly. He felt fear like anyone else. Fear of death during the Rivonia trial, fear of failure during tense negotiations, fear of civil war during the fragile transition. But he refused to be ruled by fear. This courage inspired others. When people saw Mandela walking into court with dignity or addressing crowds with calm strength, they drew courage from his example. His bravery was contagious. For leaders today, courage remains essential. Challenges such as climate change, economic inequality, and global conflict require bold decisions that may not be popular. Mandela's life teaches that true leaders do not deny fear, but act despite it. They draw strength not only for themselves, but for those they represent. Mandela's leadership principles, service, integrity, empathy, consensus, humility, and courage, are timeless. But how do they apply to today's world? Consider a few examples. In business, servant leadership can transform workplaces from environments of exploitation to cultures of collaboration. Integrity can rebuild public trust in corporations shaken by scandals. Listening and empathy can bridge generational divides within organizations. In politics, consensus building is urgently needed in polarized societies. Leaders who refuse to listen only deepen division. Mandela's inclusive style offers a roadmap for creating unity without sacrificing principle. In global affairs, humility and courage can redefine how nations interact. Instead of leaders clinging to dominance, Mandela's model shows that true strength lies in cooperation and the willingness to act for the collective good. Mandela's enduring principles of leadership are not relics of history. They are guides for the present and the future. In a time when many leaders struggle with corruption, division, and short-termism, Mandela's example stands as a beacon. He showed that leadership is service, not self-interest; integrity, not expedience; empathy, not arrogance; consensus, not domination; humility, not ego; courage, not fear. These principles built the foundation for South Africa's democracy. They also offer lessons for leaders everywhere who seek to navigate the complexities of today's world. To follow Mandela's path is not to imitate his life, but to embody the values he lived by. It is to recognize that leadership is not about commanding from the top, but about lifting others, listening deeply, and acting with courage. Mandela's legacy reminds us that the measure of leadership is not in what one achieves alone, but in what one enables others to achieve together. A call to action for today's leaders. Nelson Mandela's life was not just a story of the past. It is a continuing call to action for the present and the future. His legacy is more than a monument or a holiday. It is a set of values urgently needed in a world facing unprecedented crises. Mandela's message to today's leaders, whether in government, business, or civil society, is clear. Leadership must be rooted in courage, compassion, and commitment to justice. Our world today mirrors, in many ways, the fractures of Mandela's South Africa. We see nations torn by political polarization, communities divided by race, religion, or ideology, and societies struggling with inequality and mistrust. In such a climate, Mandela's model of reconciliation becomes not just inspiring but necessary. His willingness to forgive without forgetting is a blueprint for divided societies. Modern leaders must learn that reconciliation is not weakness, but wisdom. It is the recognition that a future of peace requires letting go of vengeance. This principle applies to global conflicts, where cycles of retaliation only deepen wounds. It also applies to democratic societies where polarization threatens stability. Leaders who choose dialogue over division are following Mandela's path. Mandela's leadership also offers guidance in confronting today's global challenges. Consider climate change, a crisis that demands cooperation beyond borders. Mandela's commitment to building consensus reminds us that only collective action can address problems that affect us all. Just as he united rival groups for the sake of South Africa, leaders today must unite nations for the sake of the planet. Economic inequality is another pressing issue. Mandela believed in dignity for all, not just for the privileged few. He worked to expand education and social programs, even in a struggling economy. His belief that leadership must serve the vulnerable challenges modern leaders to prioritize equity over profit. In the realm of human rights, Mandela's example is a reminder that silence in the face of injustice is not neutrality, but complicity. Leaders today cannot ignore the persecution of minorities, the erosion of democratic institutions, or the exploitation of workers. Mandela's life calls them to act with moral clarity, even when it is costly. One of Mandela's greatest lessons is that courage and compassion must coexist. Too often, leaders see compassion as weakness and courage as aggression. Mandela showed that the highest form of courage is the willingness to act with compassion, even toward adversaries. This lesson is urgent in today's politics, where dehumanization is common. Leaders who reduce opponents to enemies, who trade in insults and fear, may win temporary victories, but will lose the moral ground needed to sustain progress. Mandela calls us instead to recognize the humanity of others, to build bridges where others build walls. Mandela's call to action is not limited to those already in power. It is also for the next generation of leaders, students, activists, entrepreneurs, who will inherit a world of challenges. His life teaches them that leadership is not about waiting for perfect conditions. It is about rising in the midst of struggle, even when the odds are against you. For young people disillusioned with politics, Mandela offers hope. He shows that one person's commitment can change the destiny of a nation. He demonstrates that resilience, vision, and integrity can overcome even decades of oppression. The next generation can look to him as proof that leadership rooted in values can transform the world. Finally, Mandela's legacy is not just for presidents or prime ministers. It is for every individual. Each of us, in our families, workplaces, and communities, has the opportunity to practice forgiveness, to listen with empathy, to act with integrity. Leadership is not a title. It is a choice. Mandela's life calls each of us to lead where we are, to build bridges in our own spheres, and to embody the courage and compassion he lived by. Nelson Mandela often spoke of his life as a long walk to freedom, but he also made clear that the walk was not his alone. It was the journey of an entire people, and in many ways, it is a journey that continues today. His passing in 2013 did not mark the end of his influence, but the passing of the torch to future generations. Mandela's story reminds us that freedom is never given. It is won through struggle, sustained through resilience, and nurtured through reconciliation. It reminds us that leadership is not about commanding others, but about serving them. It shows us that forgiveness is not forgetting the past, but building a future where the past no longer dictates our destiny. As we reflect on his legacy, we must ask ourselves, what does Mandela's example demand of us? It demands that we face adversity with resilience, that we seek reconciliation in times of division, that we lead with integrity and humility. It demands that we see leadership not as a privilege, but as a responsibility. The long walk to freedom is not over. Around the world, oppression, injustice, and inequality still persist. The journey continues, and the footsteps of Mandela call us to keep moving forward. For today's leaders, his message is both simple and profound. Have the courage to serve, the compassion to forgive, and the vision to unite. For ordinary people, his message is equally clear. Never believe that your actions do not matter. Mandela's life is proof that one person's choices, guided by values, can change the course of history. As we close, let us remember Mandela not only as a hero of South Africa, but as a teacher for humanity. His legacy is not a chapter of the past, but a guide for the future. The long walk continues, And it is now our turn to walk with courage, with compassion, and with hope.
Thanks for listening. If you found this breakdown useful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you'll never miss the next big idea. And I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know which book you'd like us to explore next.